The fog hung low over the moors like a heavy woolen shroud, swallowing the path, the trees, and even the voices of those who dared to whisper. In the stillness of twilight, before candlelight and prayer could ward off the creeping dark, stories slithered into the minds of villagers huddled near hearths, stories of shadows that walked like men, of wolves that spoke in riddles, of fairies that blessed or cursed with equal joy. And so began the world of medieval folklore. This was not a world of gentle bedtime tales or harmless nursery rhymes. It was a terrifying mirror, one held up to a time defined by plague, famine, religious terror, and unexplained death. For people of the Middle Ages, the line between the real and the imagined was never truly drawn. Everything was possible. Everything was terrifying. The first stories were born not from ink and parchment, but from lips and fear. Oral tradition was the womb of medieval folklore. Whispered warnings carried across generations, each retelling, sharpening the edge of terror. A mother might hush her child not with a lullaby, but with a threat. Stay out of the woods, or the Hollow One will find you. No one questioned who the Hollow One was, only that he must be real if he could live forever in so many mouths. Why were such dark stories necessary? Because fear kept people safe. The woods were dangerous. Strangers could not be trusted. Illness came suddenly, without cause. The stories made sense of a world that rarely did. Medieval folklore was shaped by the land as much as by the people. In the deep forests of Germany, the Schwarzwald, tales of changelings and forest spirits thrived. In the foggy hills of England, black dogs haunted lonely travellers. Across the icy terrain of Scandinavia, the Huldra, a beautiful woman with a hollow back, lured men to their doom. Each region offered its own horrors, unique, yet always familiar. But the true terror of medieval folklore lay not just in the creatures or curses, but in what they revealed about the people who told them. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were cultural survival. They explained disease through witchcraft, justified misfortune with sin, and replaced scientific ignorance with supernatural consequence. And there was something else, something subtle but ever-present, a creeping sense of inevitability. These tales rarely had heroes. There were no shining knights to save the day. More often, the tales warned that once evil noticed you, escape was impossible. You couldn't outwit it. You couldn't reason with it. All you could do was obey the old rules. Never stray from the path. Never speak to strangers. Never look too long into the dark. Let us take a moment to imagine a common medieval night. A family sits in a single-room cottage. The only light comes from a fire crackling in a stone hearth. Outside, the wind groans like a dying beast. The forest, just beyond the farm's edge, seems to breathe. There are no police, no electricity, no clear sense of safety. A knock at the door after sundown might be a traveller, or something far worse. In this world, folklore wasn't a curiosity. It was armour. And this armour shaped entire cultures. It influenced how people raised their children, how they interpreted illness, and how they treated those who were different. A crooked back, cursed by a forest spirit. A woman with red hair, likely a witch. A child who didn't cry or laugh like others, surely a changeling left by the fair folk. We often view the past through the lens of modern knowledge. But in the Middle Ages, folklore was knowledge, and much of it came at a steep price. As we step further into this disturbing world of whispered warnings, of silent woods, of things that should not be named, we begin to see not just the monsters, but the fears that made them. Every tale is a footprint in a muddy path, a trail of breadcrumbs. Follow it carefully, for there is no promise you will return the same. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent, save for the crunch of boots on gravel. The sun had dipped below the hills, and dusk bled across the sky like ink spilled in water. That was the hour when travellers quickened their steps, not because of wolves or robbers, but because of what might be watching from the shadows. The black dog. Not a dog, truly. Not entirely. Descriptions changed from village to village, but certain details never wavered. The eyes, always burning red, like embers kept alive in the ashes of a fire long extinguished. Its coat, darker than midnight, darker than morning. Cloth seemed to drink in light. Some said it was the size of a mastiff. Others swore it stood taller than a man, but all agreed. Once you saw it, death would follow. The black dog is one of the oldest and most persistent creatures in European folklore, especially in England and parts of Wales and Scotland. Known by many names, Barghest, Padfoot, Black, Shuck, it haunted crossroads, churchyards, coastal cliffs, and lonely country lanes. A traveller seeing it once might live if they did not speak. But seeing it twice, that meant death within days. What made the black dog so deeply terrifying was not just its form, but its timing. It appeared not in dreams, but in that sliver of time when the world still felt real, when the sun had just fled and the night was still rising. It didn't howl, it didn't chase. It simply watched and followed, quiet, patient. A shadow with glowing eyes. Stories from as early as the 12th century record the beast's appearances. In 1577, a storm rolled into the English town of Bungay. As thunder cracked and the church filled with lightning, the black dog burst through the doors. Witnesses claimed it raced down the aisle, killing a man and a boy instantly. The scorched door still bears claw marks, burned into the wood, a relic of something the townspeople never forgot and never fully explained. But why a dog? In medieval times, dogs held a dual role. Loyal companions by day, yes, but at night, their howls were believed to herald death. They roamed battlefields and burial grounds, scavenging the dead. A black dog became a natural symbol of the inescapable. Death, sorrow, and punishment. In Christianity, it was said the devil sometimes took the form of a dog to walk the earth unnoticed. In Norse myth, a giant black dog named Garm guarded the gates of hell. The imagery transcended borders, feeding the same primal fear, being watched by something you couldn't confront. Many believed the black dog did not merely appear at random, it chose its victims. A sin committed, a secret kept, a promise broken. It followed those whose lives had crossed some invisible line. It was not just a symbol of death, it was a sentence passed. To protect themselves, villagers carried iron charms, crossed themselves when walking alone, and never, ever looked directly into a dog's eyes at twilight. Folklore offered no real way to fight the black dog, only to avoid drawing its gaze. If you hear footsteps and see no man, pray, went one whispered saying, for if it walks behind you, you are already lost. And yet there were stranger accounts. Some spoke of the black dog appearing beside those in mourning, sitting silently outside a widow's door or at the foot of a dying man's bed. In these stories, the dog was not the cause of death, but its herald, a dark angel, watching, waiting, respectful. Others said it accompanied travelers through danger and vanished once they were safe, like a somber guardian bound by rules. No man understood. This paradox only deepened the mystery. Was the black dog evil or simply a witness to the inevitable? Could death itself take a shape, not as a hooded figure, but as a beast with glowing eyes and a quiet tread? In one tale from Yorkshire, a soldier returned home after years abroad. One night, walking the same path he had taken as a boy, he heard paws behind him. Slow, measured. Turning, he saw nothing, but the breath on his neck chilled him more than any winter. When he reached home, his mother embraced him and collapsed dead in his arms. The black dog had walked him home, but for her, not for him. Even today, the black dog endures, not just in tales, but in language. We speak of a black dog of depression, a weight that follows, unseen. A sorrow that walks quietly behind us. Medieval folklore may have given it fangs and fur, but the feeling remains universal. So if you walk a country road and feel the hairs on your neck rise, if the shadows seem to stretch too long and the silence hums like a song almost heard. Remember the old stories? Walk swiftly, say no name aloud, and above all, do not look behind you. There was once a mother who gave birth to a healthy, rosy-cheeked child. For a few weeks, the infant thrived, laughed, suckled, and slept. But then something changed. The baby grew silent. Its cries turned shrill, its eyes distant and glassy. It stopped growing. It no longer smiled. The mother, desperate and grief-stricken, whispered the word she feared most: changeling. In the world of medieval folklore, few fears gripped the heart like that of losing a child. Not to death, but to the fair folk. Fairies, despite their modern image of glowing wings and harmless mischief, were once feared as cold, cunning, and inhumanly beautiful beings that resented mankind and played by cruel, invisible rules. One of their cruelest acts was the theft of human infants, replaced with a sickly, lifeless creature, a changeling. The changeling looked like the child at first, but slowly it revealed itself. It would cry without end, sleep with its eyes open, or eat ravenously without gaining weight. Sometimes it could speak, not babyish babble, but twisted words no infant should know. And worst of all, it would lock eyes with its mother, and in that gaze was no warmth, only mockery. Why would the fairies do this? Folklore offers many reasons. Some believed that fairy folk were unable to bear healthy children of their own and envied the beauty and vitality of human babies. Others said the fairies needed servants in their realm, and babies were taken to be raised in shadowy lands beneath the hills. Another, darker version held that fairies feared the baptism of Christian infants and stole them before they could be blessed, replacing them with their own twisted offspring. But not all changelings were infants. In some tales, even adults could be taken. A strong young man might wander into a forest, vanish and return days later, changed. He would speak slowly, forget names, grow distant from loved ones. His family might whisper that he'd been touched, that he wasn't truly himself anymore. In medieval Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Scandinavia, changeling tales were alarmingly common, and tragically, often used to justify terrible acts. A child with deformities, autism, or developmental delays was often labelled a changeling. With little understanding of medicine or psychology, villagers explained difference with folklore, and the treatments, they were horrifying. To drive out the changeling, parents might leave the child exposed in the woods overnight, hoping the fairies would return the real one. Some were placed near hot ovens or tossed briefly into rivers. The shock believed, to force the fairy's hand. In the worst cases, these children were beaten, starved, or even killed in the name of restoring the human child. One story from 19th century Ireland, eerily echoing medieval roots, tells of a woman named Bridget Cleary. Believing his wife had been taken and replaced by a fairy, her husband burned her alive, convinced the real Bridget would return. "Are you my wife?" he asked her again and again, as flames consumed her. The changeling belief had outlived the Middle Ages and still held deadly power. But beyond the horror, changeling folklore reveals something deeper. The fear of the unknown, the sorrow of parents watching a child change in inexplicable ways. It was a desperate grasp for meaning in a world without answers. The folk tales wrapped tragedy in the supernatural, giving sorrow a name and a cause, even a villain. Interestingly, some tales offered glimpses of hope. In parts of Scandinavia, it was believed that a mother who correctly identified her child as a changeling and tricked the fairies could retrieve her real baby. She might cook a meal inside an eggshell, a bizarre act meant to confuse the changeling into revealing its true identity. If the creature laughed and spoke like an adult, the spell was broken. "In all my hundreds of years," the creature might say, "never have I seen soup cooked in an eggshell." If the ruse worked, the fairies, caught, would return the stolen child. But these tales were rare. and carried no guarantees. Churches, too, played a role. A child baptized and blessed with holy water was believed to be protected, though not always. Mothers were urged to keep iron scissors near the cradle, or hang rowan wood above the door. Iron, it was believed, burned fairy flesh. Even naming the child quickly was essential. Nameless babies were more easily claimed by the otherworld. In one old tale, a mother grieving her changeling child stood by a well and sang a lullaby each night, hoping the fair folk would hear and take pity. After many nights, she awoke to a cry at her doorstep. Her real baby returned, asleep in a bundle of moss. The changeling was gone. These stories stir unease because they blur the boundary between love and horror, between grief and cruelty. They speak to the deepest vulnerability of human life, the loss of those we are meant to protect, and the despair of not knowing why. They also reflect the way communities once interpreted difference, not with understanding, but with terror. As we listen to these stories by candlelight, or whisper them into the soft dark before sleep, we begin to understand their power. The Changeling Tale is not just about fairies, it's about fear, about guilt, about the ache of watching someone you love become unfamiliar, and about the desperate hope, even now, that maybe, just maybe, the real soul is still out there, waiting to come home. The night winds rose with a scream, ripping through the treetops like claws through cloth. Branches trembled, chimneys groaned, animals shrank into corners of barns, refusing to make a sound. Then, in the distance, the horns began to blow. Not the horns of kings or soldiers, but of something older, wilder. Riders thundered across the stormy sky, cloaked in mist and madness. This was no earthly hunt. This was the wild hunt. Across medieval Europe, from Scandinavia to Germany, England to Brittany, the wild hunt was one of the most terrifying and widespread legends. Always heard before it was seen, it arrived on stormy nights when clouds churned and lightning cracked like whips. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across empty hills, and through valleys, spectral riders, black dogs, ghostly hounds, all surged through the sky in pursuit of prey no mortal ever saw. And if you saw them, if your lantern caught even a flicker of the riders in the sky above, you were marked. Those caught in the path of the wild hunt met grim fates. Some were struck dead. Others were found days later, eyes wide, mouths frozen mid-scream, bodies twisted in unnatural shapes, as if they'd seen something too vast, too impossible to name. A few vanished entirely, never seen again. And worst of all were the ones who returned. Changed, silent, pale, souls forever half lost in that storm-filled sky. The hunt had many leaders, each shaped by local culture. In Norse lands, Odin himself led the charge, the Allfather with one eye, riding Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse, commanding the dead and the damned. In Germany, it was Wotan, or a cursed nobleman doomed to ride until the end of time. In England, it might be Herne the Hunter, a horned spirit of the forest, or King Arthur, returning in death as a doom-laden omen. In Brittany, it was King Anku, the skeletal reaper who collected souls. What made the wild hunt so terrifying was its unpredictability. It could pass harmlessly over a village one night, only to strike the next. No lock or door could keep it out. It moved not just across land, but through dimensions, from the realm of the living into the shadows of the dead. It hunted with purpose, but never revealed its quarry. But what did it seek? Some said it chased souls, particularly those unbaptized or unburied. Others believed it hunted the wicked, dragging them to a netherworld as punishment. Still others feared it hunted the innocent, taking them by mistake, caught up in the fury of the ride. "Do not walk the moors when thunder growls," they would say, "for the hunt rides free, and it takes whom it pleases." There were signs it was near. Dogs would howl and cower, their eyes locked skyward. Fires would sputter without wind. The air would go suddenly cold. And always, the horns. long, low, and mournful, like the sound of a funeral march played by gods who had forgotten mercy. The only protection, it was said, was to lie down, face down, motionless, and never look up. Others advised throwing oneself into a bramble bush or reciting the Lord's Prayer backward, but none of it was certain. If you heard the hoofbeats, it was already too late. Curiously, some legends offered an alternative, not fear, but opportunity. A man who joined the wild hunt, who rode with the dead and dared the storm, might return with gifts, unworldly wisdom, power over animals, or the ability to walk between realms. But such gifts always came with a cost. He would never sleep peacefully again, and every storm that followed would stir something in his blood, a call to return to the sky. The wild hunt also served a symbolic purpose. In a world ruled by cycles of life and death, harvest and famine, the hunt embodied the chaos that could not be controlled. It was winter's howl, death's reminder, nature's revenge. It swept in like plague or war, sudden, merciless, beyond reason. It may also have served as a warning against pride. Many stories speak of noblemen who laughed at the hunt, mocked its legend, or dared to hunt on sacred days. They were always the first to vanish, their laughter replaced by screams, their names remembered only as ghosts who now ride with the storm. In later centuries, the wild hunt was softened into fairy tales or romanticized as a noble cavalcade, but in its truest, oldest form, it was a harbinger of terror and judgment, a force without face or mercy, riding endlessly beneath a sky that never forgot. And so, when wind howls through your shutters and rain strikes the earth like war drums, listen, just for a moment, for the hoofbeats, for the horns, and remember, if the wild hunt finds you, it does not matter who you are, only that you were seen. The stench came first. A bitter rot in the air. Then the silence. The fields lay empty, markets abandoned, even the bells ceased to ring. Only the crows remained, perched like black omens on rooftops. One by one, neighbors stopped answering their doors. And then, almost without warning, it arrived at your doorstep, the Black Death. It came like a whisper, but left behind a scream. When the plague tore through Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, it wasn't merely seen as a disease. To the people of the Middle Ages, it was a punishment, a curse, a divine reckoning. Science offered no comfort, and so the terrified turned instead to folklore, desperate for salvation. From this desperation rose the figures known as the plague, saints, half holy, half mythical, entirely haunting. They were not saints in the official church canon, at least not always. Some were local martyrs, others wandering healers, and a few were little more than legends wrapped in rags. But people believed in them with a fervour deeper than doctrine. Their names were whispered over fevered bodies, their images painted on walls carved into wood, worn as talismans. One of the most enduring was Saint Roche. He was said to be a young nobleman who gave up his wealth to care for the sick during a plague outbreak. When he too became ill, he retreated to the forest to die alone. But legend says a dog brought him bread each day, licking his wounds until he recovered. He emerged not only healed, but transformed, a man who could now cure with a touch. He became a symbol of both suffering and survival, often depicted lifting his tunic to reveal the black plague sore on his thigh, as if to say, "I bore this and lived." His dog too became a symbol, a companion of mercy. In some versions of the story, the dog was not just a pet, but a spirit, a divine messenger that refused to let death claim him. Folk tales around Saint Roch grew darker with time. Some claimed he could see when death would arrive in a village. Others swore he never walked, but floated, his feet never touching the ground. Then there was Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, yet still breathing. Though he had no direct link to the plague, medieval art and stories began associating his wounds with those of the afflicted. Black swellings like poisoned arrow marks, To the dying, Sebastian was a familiar figure of pain, and to the survivors, a reminder that the body could be broken and yet still endure. But not all saviors were saints. In small villages, there were cunning women, herb wives, and bone setters, local folk healers who mixed Christian prayer with ancient pagan remedies. They carried pouches of herbs, burned juniper branches, drew chalk circles around the sick. Some claimed to see illness as coloured smoke rising from the skin. Others brewed potions that glowed in the dark. Their knowledge, passed down through whispers and shadow, often proved more effective than anything the priests or nobles could offer. Naturally, these healers walked a perilous line. A cure that worked was seen as a miracle, but too many miracles, and suspicion crept in. If a woman cured 10 but the 11th died, she might be branded a witch. And during the plague, fear made monsters of men. It was not uncommon for an entire village to burn the healer who had saved their children, simply because they could not explain how she had done it. One such tale tells of a healer named Margot of the Hollow Hills, who lived alone near the edge of a French village. When the plague struck, villagers fled, all except Margot, who stayed and treated the sick with teas of fennel, garlic, and wild thyme. Dozens recovered. But then, one night, a child died, and the whispers began. Margot was accused of summoning the plague to gain power. They dragged her from her hut, beat her, and threw her into her own herb fire. Her screams were said to echo for hours, and the next day, the plague returned with vengeance, worse than ever before. Some said she had cursed the village. Others believed she had kept something darker at bay, and now it was free. In German folklore, tales arose of the Plague Maiden, a ghostly woman in white, her face veiled, her hands dripping, red. She wandered towns before outbreaks, knocking silently on doors. Those she touched would die within the week. Mothers hung red cloths above their windows to confuse her. Children were taught not to answer knocks at dusk. The maiden wasn't evil, exactly. She was fate, inevitable. And she could not be bargained with. Even priests were not spared suspicion. In times of widespread death, clergy who survived were seen with narrowed eyes. Why them? People asked. What deal had they struck? Some whispered of secret prayers known only to monks, or relics hidden beneath stone altars that shielded certain churches from death. These whispers grew into myths. The idea that sacred places could trap the plague, hold it inside their walls, like a beast behind stained glass. Pilgrimages increased. People crawled for miles to touch the bones of supposed saints, to kiss the stone where a miracle had once occurred. And as they travelled, so too did the disease, spreading with each desperate, hopeful hand. In the end, the plague saints, whether holy, folkloric, or feared, represented the desperate need for meaning. In a world where death struck without pattern, these figures gave shape to the chaos. They embodied both blame and blessing, salvation and sacrifice. And though the centuries have passed, their shadows still stretch into our stories, reminders that even in the face of invisible death, humans will always look for someone to save them, or someone to blame. The candle flickered beside the bed, casting long, trembling shadows across the stone wall. A man lay dying, skin pale, breath shallow, soul heavy. His family gathered silently, hands clasped, eyes red. But there was one more person yet to arrive. Not a priest, not a physician. A figure draped in dark rags, carrying a crust of bread and a wooden bowl of ale. The Sin Eater. In the medieval imagination, death was not just a passage, it was a reckoning. Every sin, every cruel word, every broken vow weighed down the soul. A soul burdened by unconfessed sin could not rest. It would linger, restless, and might return, twisted. Ghosts, they believed, were born not of love, but of guilt. And so, in certain parts of Britain, particularly rural Wales and the borderlands of England, a strange custom emerged. the ritual consumption of sin. The Sin Eater was not an official of the church. In fact, most priests condemned the practice. It belonged to folk tradition, older than doctrine and whispered behind closed doors. When a person died, and especially if they hadn't received proper last rites, their family would call for a Sin Eater. This solitary figure, often an outcast, would arrive and be seated near the body. On the chest of the deceased, the family would place a piece of bread and a cup of ale or wine. As silence fell, the Sin Eater would begin the rite. He would eat the bread, drink the ale, and speak words that no one dared to memorize aloud. The belief was chillingly clear. Through the act of eating, he absorbed the sins of the dead. What the soul could not confess, the flesh of another would now carry. And when he left, no one thanked him. The Sin Eater was a pariah. He carried not just stories, but spiritual disease. People would not touch him. Children were told not to look him in the eye. Some claimed he smelled of grave mold, or that his shadow bent the wrong way. He was tolerated only because he was necessary, a spiritual scavenger, willing to bear the rot others feared. Most Sin Eaters lived in isolation. Their homes were often little more than huts on the edge of town, places where the birds did not sing and the grass grew strangely. They came only when summoned, often in the night, like something between a man and a myth. Yet they were feared less than the consequences of an uncleansed soul. One tale tells of a Sin Eater named Rosin who was said to weep as she ate. A woman among a role mostly held by men, she was known for humming lullabies during the ritual. The villagers thought her mad, until a storm took half the village in one night. Only those who had employed Rosin's services, it was said, remained untouched. People whispered that she had drawn the darkness into herself, sparing those who trusted her. But with this strange power came an unbearable weight. Some believed Sin Eaters slowly became what they consumed, that over time, the evil inside them grew, whispering, corrupting, twisting their hearts. The longer they lived, the more cursed they became. Some were said to be haunted by the souls of those they had eaten for, tormented by the weight of 100 deaths. In certain villages, it was customary to bury the Sin Eater face down, so that the sins he carried would not rise again. Others burned the body with salt and herbs to purify it. A few even claimed that a Sin Eater who died with too many burdens could become a revenant, a vengeful corpse that clawed its way back to the living. Why then would anyone choose such a role? Some were desperate. The poor, the shunned, the mentally ill. Others believed they were doing divine work, taking on the pain of others as an act of redemption, a kind of martyrdom, unsanctioned and invisible. And for some, perhaps, it was a grim kind of power. To hold in one's stomach the darkness of an entire village, to know the unspoken sins of the wealthy, the secret cruelties of priests, the quiet murders never punished. That was knowledge others feared. Sin-eating was not limited to one region. Echoes of the practice appear in various forms around the world, from ancient Greek purification rituals to early Christian sects, to even the scapegoat rituals of Leviticus, where the sins of the people were placed symbolically upon an animal sent into the wilderness. The sin-eater, in essence, was a living scapegoat, and in time the practice faded. By the 18th century, official church records began to erase mentions of sin-eating, branding it pagan, heretical, and dangerous. But the stories lingered in oral tradition, and in some forgotten corners, it is said, the sin-eater still walks, not for money, but for hunger, not summoned, but arriving when the soul is too heavy for the grave to accept. There's a deeper terror in the tale of the sin-eater, not the fear of death, but the fear of what we leave behind, of secrets unspoken, of deeds unnamed, of needing someone, anyone, to take that final burden so we might sleep. So the next time you sit alone and the room grows colder and the shadows stretch long across the floor, listen. If you hear the soft crunch of footsteps and the creak of a door opening without a knock, Perhaps he has come, not to judge you, not to speak, but only to eat and carry away what no one else will. In the dim candlelight of a medieval cottage, the floorboards creaked faintly beneath the weight of 100 years. Dust clung to the beams overhead, and the air smelled faintly of herbs, earth, and something older, something secret. Deep, beneath the hearthstone or tucked within the wall, buried in silence, was a bottle, not filled with wine, not meant for joy. Inside it sloshed rusted nails, bent pins, shards of human bone, hair, urine, or even blood. This was no object of beauty or celebration. It was a witch bottle. The medieval world was one where fear lived in every shadow, and nothing was more terrifying than the invisible hand of witchcraft. Illness, infertility, withered crops, madness, all could be blamed on a neighbour's jealous glance or a stranger's whispered word. In a world without antibiotics, psychology, or meteorology, folk magic stepped in to fill the gap. And within this hidden tradition, witch bottles, also known as curse jars, became one of the most unnerving and powerful tools of counter-sorcery. At first glance, the bottle might seem harmless, a clay vessel, glass flask, or even a hollowed gourd. But inside lay a grim concoction. The victim's bodily fluids, iron nails, bent pins, thorns, and sometimes even sulfur or animal hearts. This was not superstition for its own sake. It was a desperate attempt to trap or repel dark forces that had already been set in motion. The idea was simple but chilling. If you believed yourself cursed, if strange accidents had begun to follow you, if sickness clung to your family, if your dreams were haunted by shadows, you could trap the source. By placing personal items inside the bottle, you lured the curse to its bait. The iron pins and sharp objects would then stab the curse, trapping or even killing the malevolent force. Sometimes the bottle was buried hot, fresh from the fire, to burn the curse alive inside. In some regions, the bottle was sealed with wax and buried under the threshold, so anyone entering would have to cross it. In others, it was hidden, behind chimneys, under hearthstones, or even within the walls of churches. Entire households were designed around the silent protection of these hidden wards. But these were not merely personal charms. They were weapons of psychic warfare. Some people created curse jars not to protect, but to attack. A scorned lover might slip the hair of their rival into a bottle, add crushed beetles or grave dirt, and bury it in a cemetery on a moonless night. In this dark version of the ritual, the bottle did not guard, it hunted. Those who found themselves targeted by such objects often became obsessed, believing themselves followed, sickened, or bound by unseen hands. And often, they were right. Not because of magic, perhaps, but because belief itself is a powerful poison. Fear does not need proof to become real. In medieval England, surviving examples of witch bottles have been discovered by accident during renovations or archaeological digs. A 17th century bottle was found in Greenwich containing 12 bent iron nails, nail clippings, and a tangle of hair, all sealed with human urine. Others have been uncovered beneath churches, manor houses, and even castles. Though their contents have long since dried or decayed, their purpose remains clear. A final, wordless prayer scrawled not in ink, but in rust and bone. What's more, disturbing is how often these objects are found near cradleboards or children's beds. Parents, terrified for the lives of their newborns, would bury protective bottles beneath the floor, hoping to ward off changelings, illness, or evil eyes. In some cases, the bottles contained the placenta of a newborn child, thought to be magically linked to the infant's soul. To harm the bottle was to harm the child. To protect it was to protect the child's very life. The church, predictably, condemned these practices, but many clergymen looked the other way, understanding that fear was a more powerful motivator than theology. Better a family bury a bottle in secret than accuse a neighbour of witchcraft in public. a path that often led to torture or fire. There are countless legends surrounding these objects. One tale speaks of a blacksmith who forged a bottle from melted iron nails, placing inside a frog's heart and the blood of a known witch. He buried it beneath his forge, and from that day on, his tools never broke, and no spell ever harmed his kin. But when his apprentice, unaware of its purpose, dug it up years later, the blacksmith died in his sleep that same night, clutching his chest. Another tells of a widow who found a bottle beneath her bed after her husband's death. Inside were rose thorns, strands of red hair not her own, and the teeth of a rat. She had never placed it there. Some said it was her husband's last attempt to protect her. Others whispered he had used it to bind her, and the spell died with him. There was never one rulebook for witch bottles. The ingredients varied by region, intention, and local belief. Some included wine-soaked bread, herbs like vervain and rue, bits of parchment with hastily scrawled sigils, or even insects. The bottle itself could be mundane, or ritualistically decorated, wrapped in thorns, tied with hair, or sealed with a crucifix, but always it was buried in silence. To speak of the act weakened its power. To show the bottle to another risked its failure. Folk magic thrived in secrecy, and witch bottles were among its most personal, potent, and paranoid creations. And though centuries have passed, the fear remains. Even now, there are stories. A family renovating an old cottage finds a hidden jar filled with unfamiliar filth. Days later, strange sounds begin in the walls. Lights flicker. A shadow moves just out of view. The bottle, they learn too late, was not meant to be disturbed. Perhaps it's still better to leave such things where they were buried, between the living and the dead, between fear and faith, because even the most forgotten magic may still listen and still remember. The wind rattled the shutters as the house groaned in its frame. At first, it was only scratching, like claws dragging across wood behind the walls. Then came the tapping, then the whispers. No words, just breath, a presence, something that should not have been there. And from that moment, the Bell family's lives would never be the same. While this tale reached its notorious peak in early 19th century America, its roots run deep through European medieval folklore, mirroring stories long told in isolated villages and windswept hamlets. Tales of spirits without faces, voices without bodies, and curses that outlived the cursed. The Bell Witch, a name given much later, was not a witch in the way broomsticks and black hats would suggest. She was something older, more intimate, a spirit of wrath and knowledge, malice and clarity. The story begins with John Bell, a respected farmer in Adams, Tennessee. After purchasing a piece of land, he and his family began experiencing strange phenomena. Scratching in the walls, dishes rattling without cause, heavy footsteps on the porch when no one stood there, and then a voice, feminine, mocking, cold. It knew their names. It knew their secrets. But this wasn't an isolated event. It echoed centuries of old-world ghost stories in which a household spirit attaches itself not to a place, but to a family, feeding on emotion, fear, and guilt. In medieval Europe, such a spirit might have been called a boggart, a brownie turned malevolent, or even a familiar unmoored from its witch. Often, these spirits began as nuisances, moving small objects, knocking over pots, but when ignored, they grew bold. The Bell haunting followed this pattern with disturbing precision. As the spirit's power grew, it began to speak, clear, loud, and intelligent. It quoted scripture. It argued theology. It sang hymns. And it hated one person most, John Bell. The reasons were never fully explained. Some said he had wronged a woman, Kate Batts, a neighbour rumoured to have cursed him. Others believed he had committed a hidden crime, and the spirit had come not as a tormentor, but a judge. And perhaps most chilling of all, the spirit began to hurt them. Daughter Betsy Bell was slapped in her sleep. Her hair was yanked. She awoke with welts across her face and arms. Visitors to the house reported being pushed, scratched, or taunted by an invisible force. One minister was slapped so violently that he fled the house and never returned. The haunting was no longer subtle, it was deliberate. This aligns with many European legends of vengeful household spirits, the kind that exact punishment with a conscience. These weren't mindless ghosts, but entities with rules, voices, and reasons, and their sense of justice did not always align with human understanding. In 1820, after years of torment, John Bell died, poisoned, according to the spirit itself. It declared victory with chilling satisfaction. "I fixed him," it was said to gloat. The family found a mysterious vial of black liquid among his belongings. When tested on a cat, the animal died instantly. The spirit claimed responsibility, then fell strangely quiet. But not for long. Even after John Bell's death, the spirit continued to speak. It foretold wars. It disappeared for years, only to return to descendants. One account claims that Andrew Jackson, future president of the United States, visited the Bell home during the height of the haunting. He left in terror, allegedly declaring, "I'd rather fight the British again than face the Bell Witch." The tale, while sensationalized in later centuries, still resonates because it touches on something deeply embedded in medieval folklore. The idea that injustice breeds consequence, and that some spirits do not rest until the truth is known or a wrong is righted. But what truth was the Bell Witch seeking? And was she truly a witch at all? In medieval belief, witches didn't haunt, spirits did, but the line often blurred. Women who died under suspicion of sorcery were believed to return as vengeful shadows, particularly if executed unjustly. Sometimes the very land on which they were buried refused to grow crops. Sometimes their voices could still be heard in the wind. Some historians believe the Bell Witch tale was a cultural echo, an American incarnation of European revenant legends, transplanted and evolved. In Icelandic sagas, for instance, the Draga was a restless spirit of the angry dead, returning to torment the living until its grave was disturbed or its story told. In Germany, the poltergeist would begin with noises, then escalate to violence, especially in homes where sins went unconfessed. But unlike other spirits, the Bell Witch spoke her own mind. She was not a repeating echo. She conversed, learned, and shifted. She predicted future events. She sang lullabies. She manipulated relationships. She seemed to enjoy the game, moving between punishment and affection with a disturbing fluidity. And, perhaps most terrifying of all, she chose when to leave. One day, without warning, she promised to return in 107 years. Many dismiss this as folklore within folklore, but in 1935, a descendant of the Bell family claimed to have heard the whispers again. Doors opened on their own. Books fell from shelves. The same voice, soft, cold, playful, returned, if only for a moment. Was the Bell Witch ever real? That depends on how one defines real. In the Middle Ages, the line between belief and truth was thin. A story believed by many became real through fear, through ritual, through the very fabric of daily life. The Bell Witch, like so many spirits of medieval origin, existed because people feared her, spoke of her, and waited for her. In the quiet hours before dawn, with the wind against the windows and footsteps in the attic, who's to say what is real and what is only remembered? If she was not a witch, then what was she? A wronged soul? A thought made manifest? Or merely a reflection of a house and a world cracking beneath its secrets? Whatever the answer, one truth remains. It is never truly quiet in the places we refuse to understand. The meadow shimmered under the light of the full moon. Crickets stilled. The trees stood unnaturally silent. Somewhere beyond the veil of the ordinary world, music drifted, impossibly sweet, impossibly distant. The fair folk were dancing, but not all who danced with them returned, and those who did were never quite the same. For the fairies, in medieval folklore, were not harmless. They were ancient, cold and bound by deals, dues, and tithes. Every 7 years, it was said, they owed a payment to hell, and the price was always the same: a soul. This was the tithe to hell, a terrifying belief that even the beautiful, elusive, and magical beings of the other world were subject to a darker power. It was said that every 7 years, the fair folk were required to pay a soul to the devil, but they did not offer one of their own. No, they offered one of ours. Many old ballads speak of this chilling arrangement. One of the most famous, Tam Lin, tells of a mortal man stolen by the fairies and held captive in their realm. His lover, a human woman, discovers he is to be sacrificed as the 10th soul, the fairy tithe, unless she can steal him back during a ritual procession on All Hallows' Eve. The story is romantic on the surface, but its bones are grim. It reveals that the fair folk do not take without reason, and they do not give without price. In the folklore of Scotland and Ireland, it was often believed that humans who vanished mysteriously, lost in forests, drowned in lakes, struck, dumb by sudden illness, had been taken by the fair folk, but not always for mischief or sport. Sometimes they were collected like taxes. The fairies, unable to die, still needed to feed something beyond themselves. The number 10 was sacred and cursed. In many villages, the 10th child was said to be vulnerable. Shepherds feared losing the 10th lamb. Some farmers marked every 10th seed as claimed before planting. It was not superstition, it was self-preservation. The fairies were choosy with their tithes. They did not always take the weak or the old. In fact, they often preferred the young, the beautiful, the strong, those most valued by the mortal world. To offer a rare soul to the fires of hell was a sign of respect, even pride. And it made their world more dangerous than the darkest mortal woods. This practice gave rise to strange local rituals. In parts of Wales and Cornwall, villagers carved stone circles and left offerings within them: berries, milk, strands of hair, hoping the fair folk would take the gifts instead of a person. Others built small shrines near natural springs, leaving locks of a child's hair behind as a symbolic substitution. A harmless trade, they hoped, for the real thing. But the fair folk, according to legend, could not always be appeased. Some souls were simply marked. A child born at midnight, a bride who crossed a river barefoot, a man who stepped into a fairy ring while drunk. These were signs that the veil had noticed them and that their name had been added to an unseen ledger. Once chosen, escape was nearly impossible. Those marked for the tithe might waste away, suffering from sudden paralysis, nightmares, or hallucinations. In the worst cases, they would vanish, sometimes in front of others. A blink, a heartbeat, gone. And if they were returned, they were different. In one tale, a young man named Ewan was taken at 20 and returned after a year. He remembered nothing, but spoke a language no one recognized in his sleep. His hair turned white, and his eyes lost their color. He never aged. Some said he had been tithed but was rejected, or had been traded for something worse. There were stories of people who bargained with the fairies, offering another soul in place of their own, a sibling, a lover, a stranger, and sometimes the fair folk accepted. It wasn't the soul they wanted, only that the tithe be paid. The belief in the tithe to hell served as a warning. The world beyond the veil is not ours. It runs on rules older than scripture and colder than law. Even beauty, the kind that shimmers in moonlight and dances on air, can hide a terrible hunger. This folklore also acted as a dark reflection of the medieval world's own hierarchies and obligations. Just as peasants paid tithes to the church and taxes to lords, so too did the fairies bow to a power beyond themselves. Hell demanded payment, and no one, not even the ageless, was exempt. These tales blurred the boundaries between religion and pagan belief, binding them into a single uneasy truth: something is always owed. Today, the notion of fairies has softened. They appear in storybooks with glittering wings and innocent smiles. But the older tales remain, buried perhaps, but not forgotten. And in the right place, at the right time, they resurface. In the child who vanishes near the standing stones. In the scream heard from the lake at dusk. In the wind that whispers names you've never spoken aloud. So if you ever find yourself walking a misty path beneath an ancient moon, and you hear music that pulls at your bones, be wary. Do not follow. Do not listen. For you may be the 10th. And the fair folk? They are always watching. Before the sun rose, before the dew had left the grass, the villagers would gather at the edge of the churchyard. A bell tolled once, then again, a third time. The coffin was lifted, and the funeral procession began, not along the village road, but along a narrow ancient path that wound through meadows, over stone stiles, through dense woods, and across forgotten fields. This was no ordinary trail. It was a corpse road, and the dead had walked it before. In medieval England, as well as in parts of Wales and Germany, corpse roads, also known as bier roads or lichways, were solemn, sacred routes specifically reserved for transporting the dead to consecrated burial grounds. But these roads were not simply practical. They were deeply woven into folklore, carrying with them centuries of fear, mystery, and ritual. People believed that the soul of the dead lingered on these paths, walking the same route again and again, especially if their death had been sudden, violent, or unresolved. Over time, the corpse road became more than a means of burial. It became a boundary line between the world of the living and the dead. And to stray from its rules was to invite something back with you. Many corpse roads avoided populated areas entirely, curving unnaturally around villages and farms. This was not accidental. Medieval belief held that spirits, once loosed from the body, followed the same trail they had taken to their resting place. If that trail passed through homes or near livestock, it could bring with it disease, sorrow, or even hauntings. To prevent this, special precautions were taken. Corpse stones were placed at intervals along the path, flat slabs of rock where the coffin would be set down to rest. These weren't just for the pallbearers. They were spiritual checkpoints where the soul could pause before continuing on its journey. At crossroads, the body would be turned 3 times to confuse the spirit and prevent it from finding its way back. Perhaps the most eerie tradition involved stone stiles, small arched openings in boundary walls, too narrow for carts or horses. The body would be carried through these spirit gates by hand. The belief was that the soul, once passed through the narrow gate, would not be able to return. The threshold worked like a spiritual filter, separating the living from the dead. But what happened when these customs were broken? There are countless tales of spirits who haunted the paths where their funerals had gone wrong. A coffin dropped, a shortcut taken, a prayer left unsaid. The soul, it was believed, would grow confused and angry. It would begin to walk the corpse road endlessly, its presence marked by cold spots, flickering lights, or the sound of phantom footsteps on frost-hardened ground. In one old Yorkshire tale, a young man drowned in a river miles from home. His family, desperate to bury him quickly, carried his body along a cart track instead of the designated corpse road. That winter, strange things began to happen. Cattle refusing to cross the bridge, children waking screaming from dreams of the wet man, and travellers hearing splashes in the water with no one nearby. A wise woman advised the family to re-walk the corpse road with a handful of the boy's hair and a silver coin. After that, the haunting ceased. Though the bridge remained avoided for generations, some corpse roads became infamous. Locals swore they were never to be walked after dark. They avoided speaking aloud along the paths, fearing that words might attract wandering souls. Travellers tied sprigs of rowan or hawthorn to their cloaks, both believed to ward off spirits. Others left small offerings at corpse stones, bread, herbs, or coins, to placate any soul still drifting by. And in some rare cases, the corpse road was walked backwards, If a person died under suspicious or violent circumstances, such as suicide or murder, the funeral procession would sometimes reverse direction. The mourners would walk backward, faces to the corpse, to prevent the soul from following them home. In certain regions, bells were rung not just to mark death, but to drive the spirit forward, forcing it along the road and away from the living. It was also believed that animals were sensitive to corpse roads. Horses would shy away. Dogs would growl at nothing. Birds would not sing. In one legend from Somerset, a black dog with no eyes was said to appear to lone travellers who stepped on a corpse road at midnight. It would follow them for exactly 13 steps, and if they turned to look, they would never reach home again. But corpse roads weren't just sites of fear. They were liminal spaces, places of strange beauty and quiet unease. Walked for centuries by those in mourning, they absorbed grief, hope, guilt, and silence. And in doing so, they became more than dirt paths. They became emotional scars across the landscape, as haunted by memory as by ghosts. Today, many of these ancient trails have been forgotten. Some are overgrown with moss, others paved over by roads and forgotten by maps. But occasionally, a hiker will stumble upon a strangely straight path through the woods, marked by odd stones and an uncanny stillness in the air. Birds fall silent. The temperature shifts. And though they may not know it, they walk the same route where hundreds, maybe thousands, of souls once passed. So if you ever find yourself wandering a trail that seems too quiet, where the wind carries more than just leaves, and your shadow feels too long, pause. Don't speak. Don't stray from the path. And whatever you do, never look back. In the cool earth beneath the gallows, where blood had soaked the ground and last breaths were swallowed by silence, something twisted and unnatural was said to grow. Not a flower, not a weed, but a root, shaped like a man, cursed like a demon, and feared like a god. The mandrake. To the medieval mind, few plants carried as much mystery or terror. The mandrake root was not simply another herbal remedy. It was believed to be alive, not in the gentle sense of growing things, but in a way that was unsettling, unnatural. When pulled from the ground, the mandrake was said to scream, a scream so loud and so cursed that it could kill anyone who heard it. Stories told of farmers who, lured by the promise of riches or power, attempted to harvest the root, only to fall dead before the plant even cleared the soil. Their faces were always frozen in terror, their ears bleeding. The root remained, untouched, humming faintly, like a creature that had defended itself with sound. The myth of the mandrake stretches far back into antiquity, but reached its most disturbing form during the Middle Ages. According to legend, mandrakes grew from the bodily fluids of hanged men, particularly their semen, spilled during their death throes. The gallows soil, enriched by death and pain, was the perfect womb for this twisted birth, and it looked human, or close enough to disturb. Mandrake roots often split at the base, forming shapes that mimicked legs, torsos, and arms. Some were even said to have faint features, eyes, mouths, a hint of a nose. Folk healers and occultists would sometimes carve faces into the root, dress it in rags, and speak to it as one would a spirit, because in truth, that's what they believed it was. A spirit bound to the earth, half plant, half person, entirely unpredictable. Its powers were both revered and feared. A properly harvested mandrake was said to cure infertility, induce love, protect against curses, and even allow communication with the dead. But the consequences were always whispered: madness, possession, death. One could not simply possess a mandrake. It had to be earned, tricked, or stolen with ritual. And so came the harvesting rite, perhaps the most chilling part of the mandrake. Legend. No sane man would pull it directly from the soil. Instead, the harvester would dig around the root at dusk, avoiding eye contact, and tie it to a black dog. The other end of the rope was fixed to the plant's exposed stem. Then, from a safe distance, the man would throw meat to the dog, encouraging it to leap away and pull the root free. When the mandrake screamed, The dog, unable to protect itself, would die instantly, absorbing the curse meant for man. The harvester, covering his ears, would then retrieve the root before nightfall. It was a sacrifice. The life of an innocent, exchanged for power. This act reveals the deep medieval belief that nature was not passive, but alive, conscious, and dangerous. To take from it was an act of violence. To wield its magic required blood, sometimes yours, sometimes another's. Mandrakes were also used in witchcraft, appearing in grimoires and trial records across Europe. Witches were accused of sleeping with mandrake effigies, speaking to them, feeding them blood or milk. In some cases, the root was treated like a familiar, a personal demon that could offer visions or grant wishes. It was believed that a witch could not be harmed while in possession of a mandrake, unless the root was burned. But burning it released all the magic it had ever absorbed, a release that could drive entire villages mad. Some collectors kept mandrakes in boxes lined with velvet and whispered prayers over them each morning. Others hid them under floorboards or in hollowed-out Bibles. They were considered priceless and incredibly dangerous. There are chilling accounts of mandrakes being stolen and what followed. In one tale from 15th century Bohemia, a merchant bought a root from a foreign herbalist. That night, he was found dead in his chamber, eyes wide, mouth open, the mandrake root clutched to his chest, and its carved mouth twisted into a grin. But beyond its mystical reputation, the mandrake also held practical uses in medicine. It contained powerful alkaloids that could sedate or cause hallucinations. Surgeons sometimes used mandrake extracts as a primitive anesthetic during amputations or tooth removals. However, the line between healing and poisoning was thin. Too much mandrake could stop the heart. Too little might do nothing at all. This dual nature, both curative and deadly, fed its myth, making it a perfect embodiment of forbidden knowledge. The Church, as expected, condemned the mandrake. It was labelled a diabolical plant, its use in rituals a mark of heresy. Yet the stories did not stop. They grew, passed from herbalist to apprentice, from mother to daughter, in whispered tones, in places where the walls listened. Even today, mandrake roots continue to fascinate. Modern collectors seek out specimens shaped like little men, displaying them in glass cases. Some claim they feel watched in their presence. Others report dreams. Strange, vivid dreams, after placing the root under their bed. Perhaps it is coincidence, or perhaps the soil remembers. The mandrake remains a relic of a time when people believed the land itself had a soul, and that some corners of the earth birthed things not meant for man. To pluck such a thing from the dirt was not an act of gardening. It was an invocation. So if ever you find yourself wandering in a forgotten field and you see a strange root, pale, thick, forked like legs, do not touch it. Do not dig, because some things are planted not by nature, but by death. And when pulled, they scream. It began, as many things do, with a wish. A young girl knelt beside a moss-covered well, her fingers clutching a silver coin. She whispered her desire to the dark water below, then dropped the coin in. A soft splash, a moment of silence, then a ripple, a sigh from the earth, and somewhere behind her, a voice, soft and unfamiliar, said, "Be careful what you ask for." In medieval Europe, wells were far more than sources of water. They were thresholds, mysterious openings in the ground where the mortal world met the ancient and unseen. Some were revered as holy springs, sites where saints had died or healed the sick. Others were feared as cursed mouths, bottomless and hungry. Either way, the medieval mind understood one thing clearly: wells listened. The connection between water and spirit is among the oldest in folklore. Long before Christianity spread across Europe, sacred springs were associated with pagan deities, particularly goddesses of fertility, prophecy, and death. Wells became shrines, decorated with flowers, coins, cloth strips, and carvings. People made pilgrimages to these waters, hoping for cures, visions, or blessings, but just as often, they came seeking vengeance or justice. By the Middle Ages, the Church had attempted to Christianize many of these wells, rededicating them to saints. St. Winifred's Well in Wales, for instance, was said to have sprung from the earth where the Virgin Saint's head landed after her murder. The waters were believed to heal the sick and the lame, but even such sacred places carried darker whispers. If the water could bless, it could also curse. Stories abound of people who approached these wells with impure hearts or selfish intentions and paid dearly. One tale from Lincolnshire tells of a man who stole a silver chalice from a holy well and found his hands covered in burns the next morning. Another from France speaks of a bride who wished for beauty above all else, only to fall into the well and drown, her face never found. These weren't coincidences to the medieval mind. They were punishments, signs that the well had judged them. There were rules, always. Never look into a well at midnight. Never speak your wish aloud. Never wish harm upon another. And never, under any circumstances, reach into the water to retrieve a dropped coin. For the water remembers. It takes what is given, and sometimes it takes more. Certain wells were known not for healing, but for taking. In Scotland, the so-called sorrow wells were avoided even by the desperate. Local legends claimed they were bottomless, and that voices could be heard rising from their depths on cold nights. Parents warned their children not to wander near them, for the wells were said to lure, especially the lonely, the grieving, or the guilty. One such well near a ruined chapel was believed to contain the spirit of a drowned nun, cast out for refusing her vows. She was said to whisper forgiveness to the broken-hearted and call out to those mourning lost loves. But if one leaned too close, she would reach up with cold, unseen hands and pull them into the black. The villagers left flowers and rosaries by the edge, hoping to keep her calm. More sinister still were the stories of wishing wells gone wrong. A tradition that seemed innocent, throw a coin, make a wish, had its own dark logic. What was being traded? A desire offered into the depths was a kind of bargain, a silent contract with something that heard but did not forget. In some areas, coins were not considered powerful enough. Instead, people dropped teeth, nails, blood, or even locks of hair. One gruesome story from Bavaria describes a girl who wished for her father's debt to vanish. That night, the lender's house burned to the ground. The girl, overcome with guilt, returned to the well to take back her wish, only to find her reflection smiling back at her with someone else's eyes. Wells were also believed to be portals, not just to the dead, but to fairy realms or the underworld itself. In parts of Ireland, certain wells were associated with the Sidhe, the hidden folk. They were said to dwell beneath the earth, and the wells were entry points. To drink from such a well without permission was to risk being claimed, lost forever in a world of mist and shadow. Because of this, wells were often ringed with protective charms. Rowan branches, iron nails, carved stones bearing crosses or spirals. But such protections didn't always hold. In one chilling tale, a farmer found his well filled with murky water and dead frogs. That night, his livestock began to die, one by one. A local wise woman told him the well had been offended. Someone had spat into it during a drunken dare. To cleanse it, the farmer had to pour milk, honey, and a finger pricked with blood into the well at dawn, and never speak of it again. The belief in cursed wells persisted for centuries. Some were said to move locations overnight. Others would dry up completely if someone with evil in their heart drank from them. Entire villages relocated after a series of drownings or illnesses were blamed on a soured spring. Even today, people report strange experiences near ancient wells. Electronics malfunctioning, odd echoes, a sense of being watched. Coins dropped into the water vanish without a trace. Animals refuse to drink. And in rare cases, reflections show more than one face. Perhaps these wells were never meant to be understood. They were never simply places to draw water, but thresholds between light and dark, life and death, wish and consequence. And like all thresholds, they demand respect. So the next time you pass a quiet, mossy well in an old forest or a forgotten field, pause. Do not speak. Do not toss a coin. Do not ask for anything, because wishes are heard, and some of them are granted. They found it in the cellar. 12 rats, bound together by their tails, twisted, knotted, and hardened with blood, filth, and fear. They squealed as one, moved as one, a grotesque tangle of fur and teeth, writhing in a circle as if cursed, to orbit a centre of rot. The villagers fell silent. Some crossed themselves, others wept. They knew what it was, a rat king. In the grim world of medieval folklore, no omen was more horrifying or more final. To find a rat king beneath your home, in the walls of a barn, or hidden in the rafters of a granary, was to receive a message not from man, nor God, but from something older, death. The rat king, in its most literal form, is a tangle of multiple rats whose tails have become entwined by filth, blood, freezing conditions, or unnatural adhesion, so tightly that they can no longer separate. The result is a living, crawling mass. But in medieval Europe, it was far more than a biological oddity. It was a sign and a curse. The appearance of a rat king was believed to precede catastrophe, most commonly, plague. The Black Death, which claimed the lives of millions across Europe, was closely tied to rats and the fleas they carried. But science was still centuries away from understanding bacteria. Instead, the connection was made through folklore and observation. Where rats multiplied, death soon followed. And when the rats themselves began to fuse, to become monsters, people believed something unspeakable had taken root. To find a rat king meant you were already too late. In Saxony and Prussia, legends spread of farms that were cursed when rat kings appeared in the barn loft. Cows stopped giving milk, grain turned sour, children refused to speak. One tale tells of a village where a rat king was found in the well. Within 3 days, the water turned black. Within a week, the burial ground overflowed. But the terror didn't stop with disease. Rat kings were believed to be sentient, not just knots of squealing bodies, but a single mind, an evil hive intelligence born of decay and filth. They were said to whisper in the dark, to stare with shared eyes, to know when they were being watched. A farmer in the Rhineland claimed he dreamed of a rat king crawling into his bed, whispering his name, promising him gold, and when he awoke, his tongue was gone. These were not rats, they were omens incarnate. Some folklore suggested the rat king was a punishment, sent by God for greed or hoarding. Rats, after all, thrived where grain was stored in secret, where food was locked away while others starved. To find a rat king beneath your floorboards was to be accused of selfishness, of cruelty, of keeping life for yourself while others died. In darker tales, they were said to be created by witches. In parts of Estonia and Lithuania, it was believed that witches who wished to curse a household would summon a rat king by weaving live rats together with threads soaked in grave oil. The rats would not fight each other. Instead, they would grow unnaturally calm, docile, as if possessed. Once released into the home, they would nest in secret places, breeding rot and madness. No exorcism could remove them, only fire. But fire carried its own risks. A story from 15th century Poland tells of a monastery where a rat king was found in the wine cellar. The monks, horrified, set the room ablaze. The flames spread uncontrollably. The entire monastery burned, and all within were lost. Locals whispered that the rat king had wanted to be burned, that it had carried something darker than plague, something that could only be released in smoke. Despite their horror, rat kings also carried a strange power. Some believed they were oracles, capable of revealing the future in dreams. A woman in France claimed she followed the writhing of a rat king's movements and read the patterns like runes, foretelling the deaths of nobles during the plague. Of course, she was later burned for witchcraft. Actual preserved specimens of rat kings began to appear in natural history collections by the 17th century, their tails fused together by bones and hardened flesh. Though modern science attributes these formations to cramped living conditions, entanglement, or extreme cold, none of this erases the chilling image. A living knot of vermin, trapped together, feeding and rotting in unison. And for the medieval imagination, such an image could only mean one thing. The natural world itself had turned against us, because that is what the Rat King truly symbolized. The loss of control, a world where even the smallest creatures rebelled, where death crawled into your walls and multiplied, where something unseen tied tails and twisted bodies into a living omen. To prevent such curses, villagers adopted strange rituals. Bread was left at the four corners of granaries. Cats were fed first during times of famine to ensure their loyalty. And on All Hallows' Eve, some households left out a saucer of milk and ash. Not for the cats, but for the rats. An offering, a bargain, a plea. Because to kill a rat was one thing, but to offend a rat king, that was something else. Even today, the Rat King holds sway in nightmares and dark folklore. Sightings are rare, but not unheard of. One was found in Germany in the 1820s, preserved in a jar. Another was discovered in Estonia in 2005. Scientists, skeptics, and folklorists argue endlessly. But none can deny the terror that creeps in when facing one. The unnatural motion, the horrible unity, the sound of many mouths chewing in time. It is said that if you ever hear the synchronized squealing of rats behind a wall, don't knock, don't call, and whatever you do, don't light a fire, because some kings rule from thrones of gold and others from knots of bone and fur. It was harvest time in the village of Woolpit, Suffolk, a quiet English settlement ringed by thick woods and deep hollows. The sun was high, the fields golden, and then they appeared. Two children, a boy and a girl, standing at the edge of a wolf pit. Their clothes were strange, made of a fabric no one recognized. They spoke no known language, but most disturbing of all, their skin was green. Thus began one of the strangest and most enduring mysteries of medieval folklore, the tale of the Green Children of Woolpit. First recorded in the 12th century by two separate chroniclers, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, the story was told with eerie consistency. The children were found by reapers who initially fled in fear. But the boy and girl, clearly lost and afraid, were brought into the village. They were taken to the home of a local landowner, Sir Richard de Calne, who tried to care for them. But the children refused all food, weeping silently until they were offered raw beans, which they devoured, pods and all. Over time, they adapted. The girl began to eat other food. The boy, however, grew sickly and eventually died. The girl, whose skin gradually lost its green tint, was baptized and taught English. When asked where she had come from, her answer was haunting. She said she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never shone and everything was twilight. The people there were all green like them, and they lived underground in a place of perpetual dusk. One day, they were tending their father's flocks when they heard a strange sound, a great ringing. Following the sound, they entered a cave and found themselves in Woolpit. They could not return. This story captured imaginations for centuries, not merely because of its strangeness, but because it refused to resolve itself. Unlike other folk tales, it lacked a clear moral or warning. It was not about disobedience or greed or supernatural punishment. It simply was, like a wound in the world where something slipped through. To the medieval mind, the explanation was clear. They were not from here. Some believed they were fairy children, accidentally left in the mortal world. Others said they were changeling hybrids, part human, part fae. Their green skin, strange clothing, and odd diet all supported this theory. It was well known that the Fae disliked iron food, bread, salt, and meat, preferring raw plants and beans. And the idea of a twilight realm beneath the hills was a recurring motif in British and Celtic folklore. But a darker interpretation emerged too, that the children were not magical, but damned. The green colour, in some eyes, marked them as cursed, perhaps survivors of a place struck by plague, famine, or divine punishment. Their lack of language and fear of sunlight suggested exile or punishment. Were they born underground, or had they been sent there as penance? Still others, even then, whispered stranger ideas, that the children came from the hollow earth, a separate world beneath our feet, home to a lost race of people untouched by surface life. In some versions of medieval cosmology, the earth was layered, hell below, heaven above, and perhaps something else between. A twilight world of green-skinned people who did not age, did not forget, and did not forgive. Later centuries would see rational attempts to explain the tale, suggestions that the children were Flemish orphans, lost, refugees speaking a foreign tongue, suffering from chlorosis or malnutrition. But these explanations feel like patches over a hole that resists mending. The power of the Green Children legend lies not in logic but in unease. Because they were not monstrous. They were not hostile. They were simply wrong, out of place, unnerving. Like waking in your own home and realizing a single painting has moved. Not enough to alarm, but enough to feel the air shift. And the girl? According to some records, she lived a long life. She took the name Agnes, married a royal official, and left no further clues. She never returned to St. Martin's Land. Some say she forgot. Others believe she never truly left it behind. Her children, if she had any, would have walked our world with a whisper of green in their blood, descendants of twilight. The legend spread beyond Woolpit. Similar stories appeared across Europe. Children found in forests, silent and strange, with skin tinted green, eyes too wide, or voices that hummed in unfamiliar tones. Each time, the story was treated not with celebration, but with caution, because if someone, or something, could come from beneath, it meant the borders were not secure. It meant we were not alone. In medieval folklore, borders mattered, between land and sea, forest and field, life and death. But the Green Children of Woolpit defied categorization. They were not ghosts, not demons, not spirits. They were visitors, and that perhaps was the most frightening thing of all. Not that they meant harm, but that they existed at all. Today, a sign welcomes travellers to Woolpit, proudly noting its connection to the legend. But some locals still walk quietly past the old pits at dusk. Children are warned not to play near them. And in the quiet hours, between sunset and moonrise, the fields seem to hold their breath. What if the cave opens again? What if they return? Or perhaps, what if they never left? The mill stood at the edge of the village, its wheel groaning day and night, churning water into motion, grain into flour. But no one ever saw the miller at church. No one saw him sleep. And though every other farmer struggled through poor harvests and dying livestock, the miller's sacks were always full, not just of flour, but of coin. It was whispered, not shouted. He had made a pact, the devil's pact. In medieval folklore, few professions inspired more suspicion than that of the miller. He worked alone, kept odd hours, and had control over the most vital resource, food. He was often accused of taking more than his fair share of secretly weighing grain with false stones or mixing chaff into flour. But the most disturbing rumours came when the mill's wheel turned even during drought, and when the flour began to smell faintly of iron. They said he had struck a bargain with the devil, one that bound his mill to grind not just grain, but human bone. The tale varies by region, but its core remains the same. A desperate man, a miller, often poor and mocked, is approached by a stranger in a black cloak. The man offers gold, endless grain, or unbreakable machinery, in exchange for a price. Not gold, not land, not even a soul in the usual sense, but a service. Let the mill grind for me when the stars are gone. Feed it what I bring. Ask no questions. The contract is made, often signed in blood. And at first, the reward is real. The mill never breaks. The crops are always bountiful. But then strange things begin to happen. The first signs are the sounds. Villagers speak of hearing grinding late at night, even when the mill wheel lies still. Screams muffled beneath the rumble of gears. A metallic screech, like teeth scraping stone. The flour becomes darker, sticky. Animals refuse to eat the bread. Children grow sick. One farmer, suspicious of the source of the mill's abundance, sneaks inside one night. He finds no grain, only bones, piled in sacks, bleached white, and ground to powder, and standing beside the millstone, the miller, eyes black, mouth smiling too wide. The farmer is never seen again. Such tales weren't mere ghost stories. They reflected deep anxieties about power without accountability. In many villages, the mill was physically isolated, perched on a hill at the edge of a stream or tucked in shadowed glens. The miller often had access to literacy, contracts, and coin, tools that common folk associated with the elite or with sorcery. The church stoked these fears by reminding villagers that the devil often came in disguise, not as a beast, but as a merchant, a craftsman, a man with offers. And in a time when starvation was never far away, the temptation to deal with such a figure was real. One famous folktale from Germany tells of a miller who could grind wheat during a flood, when no other water wheel in the region moved. When pressed, he claimed his wheel was blessed. But one boy followed him into the woods one evening and saw him standing in a circle of stones, whispering Latin phrases backward. The next morning, the boy's tongue was found nailed to the mill's door. The rest of him was never found. In Poland, legends tell of a midnight miller who required a single human tooth to be buried under his wheel each new moon. In return, the devil kept the gears turning. If the offering was missed, the millstone would shatter, and the nearest child would vanish by sunrise. Some pacts were passed down through generations. The grandson of a devil-bound miller might find himself heir to a cursed building, one that could not be sold, whose walls bled during thunderstorms, and whose flour never spoiled, but always whispered when poured into sacks. These legends, chilling as they were, often carried lessons. The theme was always the same. Unnatural gain brings unnatural cost. It was a warning to those who envied wealth earned too quickly, or questioned the luck of the few during widespread suffering. And yet, there was always a flicker of temptation. In these stories, what if you could end hunger for your family? What if your fields never failed again? What if you had enough coin to buy medicine, warm clothes, and land? What if the only price was a secret you never had to tell? Because the devil's pacts in these tales were rarely forced. They were offered gently, kindly, at the right moment, when desperation made men soft. And the signature required was never dramatic, just a whisper, a nod, a silent walk down to the mill after dark. There are even stranger variations of the tale. In one version, the devil gives the miller a handmade millstone carved with forbidden symbols. It turns endlessly, even when removed from water, but when the miller tries to destroy it, it shatters into dust, and the dust sings, a song that drives those who hear it into madness. Another story from Italy tells of a wandering priest who blesses a mill said to be cursed. The blessing works, but only for 7 days. On the 8th, the priest is found inside the wheel, twisted, ground to pulp, though no one ever saw him enter. Even today, old mills draw unease. Many sit abandoned, wheels still as graves, moss climbing their walls. Yet travellers report hearing creaking late at night, or footsteps pacing inside. Some say if you leave a copper coin by the door and whisper your wish, it will be granted by morning, but you must never take back the coin. Never. because some wheels, once turned by blood, never forget. So if you find yourself walking near an ancient mill, where no crops grow, where the air smells faintly of rust and the water runs too clear, keep moving. Don't look in the windows, don't speak your name, and if you hear the wheel turning when no water runs, do not stop to listen, because a deal may already be grinding and the price may already be you. The traveller came upon the bridge at twilight. Mist coiled low over the river like smoke from an unseen fire. The arch of stone, moss-covered and cracked, stood ancient and alone. As he stepped forward, his horse reared. The air grew thick. Then a voice, deep and wet as a cave's breath, growled from the shadows beneath. You cross. You pay. In the dim corners of medieval folklore, trolls were never the clumsy oafs of later fairy tales. They were not lovable, not comical. They were primordial, creatures of stone and shadow, blood and bone. Trolls were the children of rotted hills and forgotten gods, and they were feared with good reason, and nowhere was their terror more deeply felt than at the bridges they guarded. Silent sentinels of paths the living dared to cross. The idea of the troll bridge was both literal and symbolic. In Scandinavian and Northern European folklore, trolls were often said to dwell beneath bridges, especially those that crossed rushing rivers, ravines, or led into remote forested paths. These were places where the natural world changed abruptly, places of transition, and trolls, as creatures of thresholds, made them their homes. But unlike human toll keepers, trolls did not ask for coin, they asked for flesh. The stories vary, but they all share the same shape. A traveller, often alone, reaches a bridge at dusk. There is no other way forward. As he steps onto the stones, something stirs beneath. A voice calls out, slow, hungry, and old. The price might be a finger, an eye, a memory, or something worse. Some say the trolls had rules, a fair exchange, an ounce of blood for passage. Others claim they thrived on fear, that the true toll was not physical but psychic. If you trembled as you crossed, if you looked back, if you spoke aloud, the troll would rise and take you. A famous legend from Norway tells of a widow who tried to cross a bridge with her infant during the deep winter. The troll demanded the child as payment. She refused. In her desperation, she threw a silver crucifix into the river and prayed. The water froze instantly, trapping the troll beneath. For generations, no fish swam that stretch of river. Locals said the troll still waited, frozen below, dreaming of teeth and fire. In Icelandic folklore, some trolls were said to only come out on Christmas Eve, guarding sacred bridges that connected villages to their churches. Anyone who dared cross without prayer, or worse, while drunk, would vanish mid-span, their screams echoing down the icy gorge. These tales were more than stories. They were warnings. Bridges were dangerous in the medieval world. Structurally, fragile, often built of ancient stone or rotting wood, they could collapse without warning. Crossing a bridge at the wrong hour could mean falling into freezing waters. Or worse, being watched by something below. The troll, in this sense, became a personification of the risk. He was the fear of the unknown, the cost of transition. He waited at the moment of change. From one village to another, from safety into wilderness, from life into something else. Some versions of the legend added another layer of terror, the troll's collection. Every traveller who failed to pay. The toll became part of the bridge itself, bones embedded into the stone, skulls in the mortar, eyes weeping from the cracks in the walls. To walk across was to step over the dead, and the bridge, they said, grew longer each year. Children were told never to throw stones into water near bridges, lest they wake what slept beneath. Some bridges were marked with carved runes or protective symbols. Rowan branches were hung near the entrances. Others were avoided entirely after nightfall, even if it meant walking hours around. Because if you crossed during the troll's hour, the liminal hour, twilight, you risked being weighed and found lacking. One of the oldest folk tales from Sweden tells of a bridge that only appeared during the full moon. It shimmered with frost and led directly into the mountains. Many tried to cross. Most never returned. The few who did were changed, silent, pale, unable to speak of what they had seen. Their feet bled for weeks. Their dreams were filled with stone teeth and grinding sounds. The three billy goats. Gruff, now taught as a children's fable, likely evolved from much darker roots. In the original versions, the troll beneath the bridge doesn't simply threaten to eat the goats. He devours the first two. The third must outwit him with trickery and strength. The lesson was clear. Wit alone might not be enough. In some regions, trolls were believed to mark those who escaped their bridges. A handprint burned onto the back. A third shadow when the sun was low. A voice that returned in sleep, reminding you that the toll is still unpaid. Some believed that bridges themselves were cursed once a troll had claimed them. If you died crossing one, your soul became stuck, forced to remain beneath the stones, whispering warnings to others. These bridges groaned in the wind. They grew moss that never dried. And at night, if you stood quietly enough, you could hear footsteps, pacing just below your feet. Even in modern times, stories persist. Hikers speak of bridges deep in the woods where phones die, where footsteps echo twice, and where strange shapes are glimpsed in the water. Urban legends in Europe and North America now echo the old patterns. Bridges where one must hold their breath, or say a prayer, or offer something small, a coin, a button, a secret, or risk being taken. Because bridges, no matter how old or new, are still thresholds, and something still waits beneath. So if you ever find yourself at a forgotten crossing, stone cracked, mist rising, wind still, stop, listen. If you hear breathing, don't cross. If the air grows warm when it should be cold, don't cross. And if a voice speaks from below, asking for a toll you don't understand, turn back. Because some bridges do not lead where you think, and some tolls are still being collected. They buried him at dusk, as tradition required. The priest spoke hurried words, the villagers kept their eyes low, and no one lingered once the last clod of earth hit the coffin. The grave was sealed, marked, and avoided. But within a week, livestock began to die. Infants cried through the night, and just before dawn, someone saw him, the dead man, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. Long before the word zombie entered modern vocabulary, the medieval world knew another term for the returned dead, revenant. In the folklore of 12th to 14th century Europe, especially in England, France, and the Nordic regions, revenants were not mindless corpses, but deliberate, vengeful spirits that returned in physical form. Unlike ghosts, they had weight, breath, hunger. They emerged from the grave not to frighten, but to torment, drawn back by unfulfilled curses, improper burial, or, most terrifyingly, their own will. Medieval chroniclers recorded cases with disturbing calm. In Historia Rerum Anglicarum, the monk William of Newburgh writes of a man in Yorkshire who returned nightly to terrorize his village after death, whispering foul things through windows, climbing onto rooftops, strangling animals. The people, driven to desperation, dug up his body and found it undecayed. They beheaded it, burned the remains, and only then did the hauntings cease. These stories weren't just told around fires. They were documented as real occurrences, believed not just by the illiterate peasantry, but by monks, nobles, and clergy. Revenants were often associated with unconfessed sins, excommunication, suicide, or unjust death. A soul denied proper. Rites might rot in the earth, but its rage would not. The most feared revenants were those who had once held power, cruel lords, corrupt clergy, or violent soldiers. When they returned, they retained not only memory, but malevolence. They remembered those who wronged them, or worse, those they had wronged, drawn back to finish what they started. To protect the living, Burial practices became increasingly layered with superstition. Bodies were sometimes interred with mouths filled with stones or bricks to prevent them from biting. Limbs were bound. Chests were pierced with iron stakes. In some parts of Eastern Europe, corpses were buried face down, so that if they awoke, they would dig deeper, not upwards. The line between religious rite and magical precaution blurred. The church warned against superstition, but quietly adopted elements of it. Holy water was splashed liberally. Graves were blessed not once, but thrice. Bell ropes were hung over fresh graves to allow the buried soul to ring for help, or for warning. Alongside revenants came another spectral figure, the church grim. Unlike revenants, the grim was not evil, but it was no less terrifying. In English and Scandinavian folklore, the church grim was a guardian spirit, said to protect sacred ground, but its origins were soaked in blood. In many rural communities, it was believed that to properly consecrate a church, a living creature, often a black dog, ram, or even a newborn lamb, had to be buried alive beneath the altar. This animal's soul would bind itself to the land, becoming the grim. It was seen only in times of danger, wars, plagues, or desecrations. Appearing as a black dog with glowing eyes, it would pace the graveyard, warding off thieves, witches, and even revenants. But it could also be an omen. If a person saw the grim during a funeral, it was believed they would be next to die. 1. Norse legend speaks of a church built on cursed land, where the first creature to enter would be claimed by the spirits. To trick fate, the villagers sent a dog inside. The dog fell dead at the threshold. That night, it rose again, its eyes white, and took its place beneath the bell tower, forever guarding, forever bound. Church grims were respected, even feared, but never challenged. Stories abound of gravediggers who mocked the grim and were found dead the next morning, limbs twisted. One tale tells of a priest who attempted to banish a grim using exorcism rites. He vanished during evening mass. Only a smear of soot was found on the altar steps. Then there were the restless buried, not revenants or guardians, but those whose deaths were unnatural or unresolved. In medieval Ireland, such souls were called the wandering dead. They could not pass on until their bones were recovered, their names cleared, or the truth of their death was spoken aloud. In some villages, it was common practice to leave small windows in grave markers, so the soul could look out and see the world. A strange compromise between death and memory. Others left coins on graves monthly, believing that the dead needed payment not for passage, but to stay where they were. The boundaries between the living and dead were fragile, especially during certain times of year. All Hallows' Eve, the winter solstice, or the first thaw of spring. On these days, it was said that the veil thinned and the dead could walk, not with moans, but with purpose. Some came to warn, some came to curse, and some simply came home. In one chilling account from 14th century Bohemia, a girl who drowned in a frozen pond was buried without a priest's blessing, as no one could reach the village church due to snow. That spring, strange wet footprints began appearing in her family's home. The food rotted, milk turned black, and always, the sound of dripping water echoed behind closed doors. Only after her body was exhumed and reburied with full rites did the signs cease. What made these stories so enduring was their closeness. Revenants were not legends from distant lands. They were neighbors, priests, fathers, children, and the fear they inspired was not of monsters, but of recognition. What if someone you loved came back, not as themselves? Even now, many old graveyards carry warnings. Stone angels with weeping faces, iron fences twisted like cages, graves so deep they seem to sink forever. Not because we forget the dead, but because we remember what they were capable of. So the next time you pass a cemetery in the fog and you see a dark figure standing perfectly still near a headstone, do not call out, do not wave. Because sometimes the dead do not rest, and sometimes they are watching you back. The midwife crossed herself and turned away, trembling. The mother lay still on the straw pallet, pale and soaked with sweat, her eyes wide not from the pain of labor, but from what had emerged. It squirmed, slick and silent, without a face. No cry, no movement of the arms. Just folds of pale flesh and twisted limbs, as if shaped by a sculptor who had never seen a child before. They did not speak its name. They could not, because this was no child. This was a mooncalf. In medieval and Renaissance folklore, the term mooncalf referred to a creature born malformed, not just physically, but spiritually wrong. It was believed to be the result of unnatural forces, lunar interference, demonic corruption, or divine punishment. Though modern medicine might explain such births through genetics or disease, the medieval mind interpreted these monstrous forms as omens, curses, and punishments, made flesh. The moon, long associated with madness, from the Latin luna, was believed to affect the body, especially women. Midwives and herbalists spoke of the moon's pull on blood, fertility, and the womb. A child conceived or born under the wrong moon phase was at risk. A woman who gazed too long at a blood moon might carry its image inside her. A pregnant mother who dreamed of beasts or committed sins in secret could imprint her guilt onto the unborn. The mooncalf was often described as pale, limbless, or born with unnatural features. Extra eyes, no mouth, hands like claws, hair where there should be none. Sometimes it resembled a human only vaguely. In the darkest accounts, the mooncalf was entirely animalistic, frog-shaped, snake-like, or even with wings. It didn't live long, and if it did, it was hidden, or worse, destroyed. Because to raise a mooncalf was to invite judgment. Such births were viewed not merely as tragedies, but as warnings. The woman who bore one might be accused of fornication, witchcraft, or worse, of consorting with demons. In many regions, the child was not baptized. It was buried in unmarked ground, away from the churchyard, sometimes beneath crossroads where spirits could not rise. In one tale from 13th century France, a woman gave birth to a child with the body of a lamb and the face of a man. The local priest declared it a punishment for her sins, though she was known to be devout. Days later, her home burned to the ground. The villagers believed it was divine cleansing, but not all monstrous births were condemned. In rare cases, a mooncalf was seen as a message, a prophet in flesh, a child who had glimpsed the other side, even in the womb, and returned to speak of it. Such children were sometimes kept alive in secret, fed strange herbs, and consulted in whispers. One legend from Bohemia tells of a mooncalf raised by nuns who could speak in full sentences at 6 months. It predicted a famine that came true the following year. Still, most mooncalves were viewed with terror. Some were said to curse their families simply by being born. Cattle would die, crops would rot. The mother might bleed for weeks, and any children, born afterward, would be mute or sickly. In some superstitions, the mooncalf's flesh was considered poisonous. Touching it could cause madness. Even a glimpse might steal your sleep. To prevent such births, women followed elaborate rituals. Charms made from iron and bone were worn around the waist. Prayers to specific saints, especially St. Margaret, patron of childbirth, were whispered daily. Husbands were warned not to lie with their wives under certain stars or during eclipses, or on feast days sacred to the Virgin. The womb, after all, was a gate, and gates could be opened by the wrong key. Interestingly, the idea of monstrous births wasn't limited to the common folk. Royal courts recorded them with solemnity. In 1512, a malformed child was born in England during a time of political unrest. Chroniclers claimed it had scales instead of skin. The child's arrival was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, and soon after, a rebellion broke out. The connection was never questioned. Some mooncalves were displayed, held up in marketplaces, churches, and travelling fairs. They were called monsters, not as insult, but as portents, from the Latin monstrare, to show. They were divine demonstrations, proof that something in the world had gone awry. And where science failed to explain, folklore stepped in. 1. Belief held that a woman could conceive a mooncalf by thought alone, by fixating on an animal, a demon, or even a saint too obsessively. Her desire or fear would twist the forming child. Another tale tells of a nun who gave birth to a headless infant after hiding a sin for 7 years. The head was later found buried in her cell wall. In such a world, a pregnant woman lived not only in hope, but in dread. Today, the term mooncalf has faded into obscurity, surviving mostly in literature or satire. But the unease it once evoked remains. We still fear what gestates beyond our control. We still wonder what the body remembers, what it can carry, what it might become. In a sense, the mooncalf is not a monster. It is a mirror, a reflection of guilt, fear, and the human urge to explain the unexplainable through story. A child born strange becomes the canvas upon which a village paints its conscience. So if you ever come across a tale of a birth that was quickly hidden, a grave marked with no name, or a family line that speaks little of its origins, listen closely. There may be more to the silence. And if, under the full moon, you hear soft crying from beneath the earth, not human, not animal, don't look for it. Some things are born wrong, and some are never truly buried. The path was clear that morning. A narrow trail winding through the moss-thick woods, marked with stones and worn by hooves and boots alike. But by dusk, it had vanished. Trees closed in like the jaws of a trap, their branches twisting above like clawed hands. The wind no longer passed through the leaves. The forest grew still, and the man who entered it would never walk out again. In medieval Europe, forests were not symbols of peace or natural beauty. They were alive, vast, unknowable, and filled with everything that civilization feared. To enter the deep woods was to cross into another world, a place without roads, laws, or light. A place that remembered you. Among the most unsettling legends of medieval folklore is the belief in forests that devoured men, not by wolves or bandits, but by the woods themselves, places where time unraveled, paths moved, and even the trees bore grudges. In some stories, the forest was said to be cursed. In others, it was simply awake. One such forest was the Schwarzwald, or Black Forest, in what is now Germany. Travellers told of being followed by trees that creaked without wind, of lights that hovered between trunks, leading them deeper until they no longer recognized the sky. Some said the forest had no center, only more layers. You could walk for days, following your own footprints in endless circles, until you forgot your name. In Brittany, peasants avoided the Brocéliande woods, where it was believed time bent like bark. Knights who entered seeking glory returned decades later, unchanged in body but broken in mind. One man claimed to have spent 3 days hunting a silver boar, only to return and find his village overgrown, his wife remarried, his sons old and grey. But these weren't just tales of getting lost. These were stories of the forest as a sentient, malevolent entity. In some traditions, the forest was said to have a heart, a sacred or profane center, hidden and shifting. Those who reached it were granted visions or power, or were never seen again. Some believed that every forest had its own guardian, not a spirit, but a tree, older than the rest, with bark blackened by age and hollow eyes that opened at dusk. If it looked at you, you forgot why you had come. These beliefs were not confined to a single region. In Slavic folklore, the Leshy was a powerful forest spirit, neither good nor evil, but entirely alien in purpose. He could mimic voices to lure travelers, hide paths, or twist time. Children were warned never to answer their own names if they heard them whispered in the trees. The Leshy, once invited in, could lead you somewhere you couldn't return from. Some legends told of trees that grew from the bones of the lost, roots fed on blood, trunks twisted by pain. Certain woods were avoided entirely, especially if birds never sang there, or if fog clung to the ground even on clear days. Superstition held that these forests had taken too many lives and now hungered for more. They did not want you to visit. They wanted you to stay. Villages developed customs. To survive near such places, travelers carried iron nails in their shoes or wore rosemary in their belts to prevent enchantment. Paths were marked with carved stones bearing religious symbols, which were checked daily for movement. Before entering a forest, one was expected to speak their full name aloud, a declaration of self, a reminder to the woods that they were real and rooted. And when someone disappeared, there were protocols. The village would wait exactly 3 days. If no sign came, the name of the lost was struck from record. Their home was emptied and burned. Prayers were offered to St. Hubert, patron saint of woodsmen and hunters. And then, silence. The idea was simple, to cut ties so the forest could not use them as bait. But sometimes the forest gave something back. Not the person, but pieces. A shoe found hanging from a branch 30 feet high. A locket laid gently on a stump. Or worse, a traveller who returned mute, eyes empty, skin cold to the touch, who never stepped beyond his own threshold again. In one disturbing account from 14th century Bohemia, a woodcutter returned after being lost for 12 days. He could not speak. When he finally wrote a message in charcoal, it read, "The trees spoke. I answered. I shouldn't have." Not all trees were equal. Some species, like yew, elder, and oak, were considered especially dangerous when found in isolation. A single yew standing in the center of a clearing was avoided entirely, believed to be a forest mouth where the earth swallowed secrets. If you saw a ring of mushrooms, a fairy circle, you stepped around it, never through. It wasn't. Only people who were vulnerable. Entire armies vanished in forests. In one Hungarian tale, a band of 300 soldiers entered the woods to pursue raiders. Not one returned. Months later, bones were found hung from branches like ornaments. None bore signs of combat. Even now, deep forests retain an ancient silence. GPS signals falter. Compass needles spin. And sometimes, inexplicably, voices are heard. Too far to be real. Too close to be ignored. They say your name. They sound familiar. Perhaps the most frightening thing is this. The forest does not hate you. It doesn't need to. It is old. It is vast. It was here before you, and it will be here long after. And if it chooses to open for you, it may never open again. So if you ever step beneath a canopy so thick that the sky disappears and the air grows heavy, and every footstep feels like it echoes in a deeper place, be careful. Mark your path. Speak your name. And if the forest speaks back, run. She stood in the center of the village square, barefoot, wrists bound, hair matted with rain. The priest gestured to the bruises on her back, the birthmark at her collarbone, the scar behind her ear. "There," he said. "There are the marks," the crowd murmured. Stones shifted beneath their feet. And just like that, she was no longer a woman. She was a witch. In the hysteria that swept across medieval Europe, the line between sickness, suspicion, and sin vanished, swallowed by flame and fear. And nowhere was that fear more obsessively focused than on the body itself. Skin became a map, a message, a confession. And the signs they searched for were known as devil's marks. These so-called marks were physical signs believed to prove a person's allegiance to the devil. They could take many forms: moles, scars, patches of discolored skin, third nipples, strange birthmarks, or even small bumps. Midwives, peasants, and lords alike were accused. Their guilt determined not by their actions, but by the presence of something unusual on their skin. It was not superstition alone. There was a system. Witch hunters, many operating under the authority of both church and crown, used sharp needles or knives to prick every inch of the accused's body. The theory was simple. Somewhere on the body would be a numb spot, a place that would not bleed or feel pain. This was the devil's seal, placed during the supposed pact between witch and demon. It was said to be the point through which dark power entered, and where a familiar, an impish servant could suckle. These witch prickers, as they were known, carried specialized tools, retractable needles designed to produce no wound, faking the proof they were paid to find. Trials were often held in public. Women were stripped, examined in front of entire villages, and branded guilty not by evidence, but by biology and bias. But the fear ran deeper. In medieval belief, the devil's mark wasn't just a brand, it was a contract burned into the body at the moment of allegiance. The mark gave the witch power over weather, livestock, fertility, even death, and in return, she surrendered her soul. These marks were said to be impossible to remove. Cut them, and they bled black. Burn them, and they reappeared. Hide them, and the devil made new ones. The witch's teat was a particularly feared variation, a small lump or extra nipple where familiars were believed to suckle blood. Many women were accused on this evidence alone, even if the mark was little more than a cyst or skin tag. One account from 1588 details a woman executed after a midwife testified that her mole did twitch when she lay sleeping, as if it yearned for the devil's kiss. Some believed these marks could move, that when a witch sensed danger, the devil would shift the mark to another part of her body, hiding it from inquisitors. In response, the prickers worked tirelessly, pricking beneath fingernails, behind ears, between toes, anywhere flesh could hide secrets. But where did this obsession begin? Part of it lay in scripture, twisted and misread. Verses about marks of the beast were interpreted literally. Medieval theologians warned that Satan, being proud, always marked his own. And in a world where bodies were not private, where birth, disease, and death were communal, the skin became a battlefield. A woman who lived alone or healed with herbs or laughed too loudly could be suspected, and once accused, her skin would be scoured for proof. A freckle became a curse. A scar became a sin. In one chilling case from 17th century Scotland, a young woman was accused after a dream was reported. Not hers, but her neighbour's. She was said to have ridden a stag through the sky, her cloak trailing stars. When searched, they found a mole beneath her breast. That was all it took. She was burned within the week. But the marks weren't only about persecution. They reflected a deeper anxiety, the fear that evil looked ordinary, that the devil did not appear in monstrous form, but in the form of a mother, a midwife, a servant, girl. And so people turned to the body, the last place secrets could be kept, and tried to read it like scripture. Some stories twisted this further. It was said that witches could pass the mark on, by touch, by blood, even by eye contact, that to share a bed with one was to risk being branded yourself. In villages where executions occurred, people avoided stepping on the ashes of the burned, fearing that the mark might rise with the smoke and settle on another. And yet, in rare whispers, there were tales of those who sought the mark willingly. A girl, sick with grief, praying for her child to return from death. A man, starving through winter, begging for grain. A promise made at midnight beneath a crossroads. The devil arrives not with fire, but with comfort. He presses his hand to your shoulder. When he lifts it, your skin is warmer, and you are never cold again. The mark glows, but only you can see it. Even today, some believe the devil's mark survives in different forms. In certain prisons, gangs, or cults, tattoos serve similar functions, signs of allegiance, of transformation. In conspiracy circles, celebrities are accused of hiding occult markings behind clothing or makeup. The skin, even now, is a canvas of suspicion. But in truth, the real mark was never on the body. It was in the eyes of those who looked too closely, those who sought evil so desperately that they found it in freckles, those who feared their neighbors more than they feared the devil, and those who forgot that skin, flawed, scarred, marked by life, is not evil, it is human. So if ever you hear a tale of a woman burned for a birthmark, or a man drowned for a scar, remember, they weren't condemned for what they did. They were condemned for what they looked like, and for what others believed they were. The fight. Devil may mark his own, but we do far worse. We mark each other. They say the harp played itself. Late at night, in the hall of a forgotten nobleman's estate, it would sing, not with strings of gut or silk, but with cords of pale, stretched sinew. The frame was not carved from yew or cedar, but from femur and rib, shaped delicately, reverently. Each note that rang from it was hollow and cold, echoing with the voices of the dead, and those who heard it claimed they dreamed not in images, but in memories that were not their own. This was the bone harp, one of the most morbid and mesmerizing artifacts in the world of medieval folklore. A supposed instrument crafted from the remains of the dead, usually those wronged or betrayed, and enchanted to sing their vengeance into the world. Though the stories vary, the central myth remains unnervingly consistent across cultures. Someone is killed unjustly, buried without honor, and later their bones are discovered, not by accident, but by purpose. A harper, a bard, or a witch retrieves the bones and fashions an instrument from them. The harp, once completed, cannot be tuned by human hands. Its songs are not chosen, they are remembered. In one of the most famous variations, found in Scottish and Scandinavian lore, a jealous sister kills her younger sibling and hides the body in the woods. A travelling harpist, lost in the forest, stumbles upon the bones years later, exposed by erosion and time. Feeling drawn, he crafts a harp from the remains, the skull forming the body, the ribs the soundboard, the long bones forming the neck. The first time he plays it, the harp sings the truth of the murder aloud, naming names, revealing the deed, and weeping its own melody. From that point on, the harp is cursed. Wherever it is played, secrets rise. Listeners become possessed by guilt, or suffer visions of deaths they never caused. In some tales, the harp cannot be silenced. Even if burned or buried, its song finds its way into the wind. In others, it is said to sing only under moonlight, its melody audible only to those who have blood on their hands. Medieval folk believed deeply in the power of music to touch the divine and the damned. Music was not mere entertainment, but ritual. Psalms guarded the soul. Bells warded off evil spirits. Chanting healed the mind. So the idea of music created from desecration was not just grotesque, it was a blasphemy. The bone harp, then, became a symbol of ultimate transgression, but also of justice. A harp made from bones wasn't just a grotesque object, it was a truth teller. It did what priests, kings, and courts could not. It named the guilty. The songs it played were not composed, but inherited, born from suffering and silence. To hear such a song was to confront the past, and to be changed by it. This idea appears across borders. In medieval German ballads, there is the tale of a noblewoman who disappears the night before her wedding. Her bones are discovered a decade later beneath the flagstones of the family chapel. A harpist unknowingly crafts an instrument from the remains, and during a banquet for the noble family, the harp sings, "I was wed to silence, buried in stone. Now my song is justice, my strings are bone." The feast ends in blood. Not all bone harps spoke in words. Some were said to invoke madness. One Breton tale speaks of a harp that, when played, caused its listeners to sob uncontrollably. Another caused wolves to gather at the threshold of any building where it was strummed. In one of the darkest variations, the harp's music caused those who heard it to relive their worst memory, again and again, until their minds broke. There were methods, too, to make these instruments, grim recipes passed down in secret texts. The bones had to be unjustly buried, the sinew pulled under a blood moon, the skull washed in spring water stolen from a holy well. The strings were sometimes made from hair, taken from the murdered or from the murderer. It was never just about craft. It was ritual, revenge, resurrection. Of course, many of these stories were likely cautionary, warnings against betrayal, murder, or silence in the face of injustice. But they were also expressions of a deeper, medieval fear that the dead remember, and that memory, once given voice, cannot be silenced. The Church, predictably, condemned all such objects as diabolical. Instruments made from bone were declared heretical, and any musician accused of possessing one could be tortured or executed. But despite the Church's attempts to suppress them, the stories spread, because people knew the truth. There are songs that want to be heard. In some remote regions, folk stories claim that bone harps still exist, hidden in the walls of ruined abbeys, beneath roots in cursed forests, or buried with the last of the bloodline they condemned. A harp made from the bones of an innocent can never be destroyed by fire, only silenced by being played once more until its final song is spent. There's even a tale of a modern collector who purchased an antique harp from an estate sale in Eastern Europe. It was carved from ivory, but laced with strange discoloration and wear. When tuned, it emitted a single note, low, mournful, and vibrating long after it should have ended. That night, the collector died in his sleep. His wife swore she heard music in the house. The harp was never found. Ultimately, the bone harp is not just an artifact of horror. It is a symbol of the buried truth, of pain given shape, of injustice given voice. It reminds us that the past is never truly silent, and that the human body, even in death, can become a vessel for stories that refuse to stay buried. So if you ever hear a harp playing in the woods when no player can be seen, and the notes sound too mournful, too human, listen, but do not follow, because some songs were never meant for the living, and some music does not end. It begins with a whisper, a nursery rhyme, a caution, a joke shared near a fire, a bedtime tale told with a grin. Don't stray from the path. Don't look into the well. Don't follow the music. But then the tale lingers. You dream of it. You feel it watching. And by then, it's no longer just a story. Throughout this journey into the disturbing world of medieval folklore, we've witnessed the strange and the sorrowful, bone harps that sing with the voices of the murdered, forests that devour the lost, infants born as omens, devils who leave no burn but a blemish. But beneath the horror lies something more enduring, more dangerous, belief. Because folklore doesn't need facts, it needs only fear. In the medieval world, where famine, disease, and death were daily companions, the line between reality and imagination wasn't blurry. It was non-existent. To believe in curses, revenants, fairies, witches, and forest spirits was not foolish. It was survival. When the world gave no answers, stories stepped in to fill the void. And once belief takes root, it grows like ivy, twisting through generations, reshaping how people behave, who they trust, where they walk, and what they fear. Folklore was not passive. It created real laws, real violence, real fire. A woman was drowned because she birthed a stillborn under a red moon. A man was flayed because his millstone never stopped turning. A child was chained inside to keep changelings at bay. These were not metaphorical punishments. They happened, recorded in ink, in ash, in blood. But perhaps more unsettling is that so much of this folklore still lingers, not in form, but in function. Modern ghost stories, urban legends, internet creepypastas, all echoes of ancient fears. We still tell tales of roads where screams echo without source. We still fear houses where people vanish. We still whisper warnings to children about going into the woods alone. We still blame the strange, still isolate the different, still fear what we can't name. Folklore has evolved, but its roots are the same. And in some quiet ways, it has never been more alive. Take a look at a map of Europe's oldest settlements. Notice how many places are still named after devils, witches, ghosts, or saints. Devil's Bridge, Witch Hollow, Hell's Gate, Saints Hollow. Why are they still named that centuries later? Because belief doesn't die with time. It becomes architecture, geography, memory. In medieval folklore, there was often mention of a final toll, the idea that after all was said and done, the dead would ask one last price from the living. That stories themselves had to be paid for, not with gold, but with attention, retelling, memory. The moment we speak a story aloud, we carry its shadow. This is the final toll. When folklore crosses from story into belief, and then from belief into behavior, it never really fades. It hides behind modernity. It wears new names, but its essence remains. Fear, dressed as caution. Wonder, dressed as warning. Grief, dressed as magic. Why else do we keep telling them? Why, in an age of science and satellites, do we still feel dread walking into dark woods? Why do we pause before mirrors or hold our breath at the edge of an old well? Why do we avoid certain places without knowing why? Because somewhere inside us, the old stories still live. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. Not that the bone harp sings, not that the forest watches, not that the dead return, but that we, across centuries, across languages and faiths, keep listening. We want to be afraid. We want to believe. And in doing so, we feed the stories, we nurture them, we become them. So as you close this book, or this video, or this voice in your ear, listen closely to the silence that follows. Because maybe, just maybe, something has followed you back. The whisper in the mirror, the dream you won't remember by morning, the sound outside your window, the ripple in your reflection, and, if it has, well, you already know what not to do. Don't speak your name, don't look back, and above all, don't stop listening.